again. It's me, Caleb Bonet, and we're back in Zokunushrir. Sorry for the delay, but I've been very busy working on this episode. The flood of Dwarf Fortress content in the brand new Steam version has been insane, and I'm happy to see the game reach new people. I've already coached a friend of my own through the first steps of the fort myself, and watched the rise and fall of so many more first-time forts since then. But Zokunushrir was no first-time fort. It was quickly becoming one of the most industrious places in our part of the world, no longer hurting for food, water, or booze, and full of hard-working and fully militarized dwarves. And remember, last episode, I told you to keep an eye on a certain Stukos Cattenrazes? Well, here they are. The Azer Dwarf, forged into being, object of many, many works of art. The genderless legend Stukos Cattenrazes has been elected mayor of our fort. Whether by trade wagon, pigeon, or underground by fungal crow, news of the charismatic Stukos Cattenrazes beat them to the fort, and their election was basically unanimous. Almost immediately upon arrival, Stukos created Morolgim, Page Twist, an artifact which depicts the founding of Siegequakes itself on it. Like Stukos, it would become a much sought-after artifact across the entirety of the mythical domain. We built the fortress to be a multifaceted machine of war. So as our dwarves trained, so did our animals. The many dogs we'd bred were among the first to be trained to fight. But so were the monsters we trapped in the caverns. Cave hounds, deep stalkers, and even the dreaded vine serpents. And look, I wouldn't say we were rock solid yet, but when monsters came to our fort, they sure as hell didn't leave. I felt like I had to get the dwarves conditioned to fighting real targets, so we built a rather barbaric chamber for chaining up animals we'd captured so we could train on them more easily. This was a messy and inefficient process, but it helped keep our cage traps clean at the very least. The speed of progress in Zokunushrir began to slow down considerably, which was good. We were settling into our stride. Occasionally I noticed some new things, like sometimes creatures would cast spells in the midst of battle to aid them, like this Dark Dweller tribeswoman casting something called Shade Walk, which I think acts as a cleansing spell of some kind. It was in this year that I began the process of constructing temples, a process that I would come to undo down the road, owing to how absurdly many religions there were in this version of the game, and just how awful it became to micromanage. While I was supervising a little mining towards the end of the year, I got a combat message I wasn't really that excited about. A lemur was fighting one of our visitors. At first I didn't notice anything wrong, but then I saw it. Fire. So it's still a little unclear to me, but I'm pretty sure that the lemurs bleed fire. They can definitely breathe it, but they also bleed it. Which means that any lemur that's wounded just bleeds fire. I spent the last few weeks of the year watching the resulting wildfire wipe out the entire forest for the first, but certainly not the last time. There was still vegetation at the end, of course, but we'd have to be careful not to chop down dead, ashy trees, some of which were still smoldering from the demon disaster. We had a pretty chill start this year, trading again with the elves. It was fairly disappointing, although they did bring a jaguar, which was pretty cool. I hope they wouldn't see the, cave creature grinding machine we had going across the fort. Was this the ethical way to progress? Was this the correct way to progress? Yes. Progression was in fact happening. It seems almost pointless to mention the swarms of orcs that were showing up every year, but they were still here. I was trying to gauge how tough they really were. An Azer Marks dwarf foolishly decided to visit the fort this summer, and I watched the combat anxiously. They dodged excellently, swiftly moving to avoid multiple shooters. Even with a vastly undermatched melee weapon, they were landing blows, knocking teeth out and breaking bones. Their unfortunate death, inevitable death I guess, was drawn out and brutal, but it showed me that the orcs might be more easily outmaneuvered than I originally thought. Other than that, year 106, still grinding, still bedrooming, still... What are we doing? Isn't there supposed to be a goddamn goblin pit around here? Oh, right. I had this idea for a tower. It would be above ground, only a couple Z levels high, with a drawbridge on the bottom level, and fortifications up top so that the dwarves could shoot out. Perfect. And what an incredible time for a goblin pit as well. Our main fortress defenses were finally coming together now that we had a minute to just relax and build. A good time after we finished the tower, an enormous hill titan shaped like a weevil appeared. I guess I planned to let it deal with the next band of invaders because I just let it sit there. And that's how year 7 ended, for real. Things are going to accelerate a little bit now that our troubles are less numerous and we move towards our goal of systematic orcish annihilation. Year 8, and invaders failed to appear, so I sent the dwarves out to deal with the hill titan. The fight was barely worth mentioning, except for that it highlighted just how good the dwarves were getting at combat. They were living now aside thriving populations of war animals, dogs, cave hounds, stray scavenger flowers, and vine serpents that we'd trapped in the caverns. They wandered freely throughout the fort and frequently picked fights with whatever they wanted. The elves still came to trade with us, but had little to offer. Zokunushrir certainly wouldn't fall to carelessness. I was being polite with the locals and overly cautious with my years of martial training, war animal breeding, and layered defenses. The giant pit trap was now a couple Z levels deep below the main fort, inching down toward the caverns. Slow going, but we had nothing but time. At the same time that the pit was expanding down, I'd also sent a group of miners to see just how far down we could go. As usual, I made a series of open rooms that switched back on each other every 10 Z levels down or so. You never knew where a threat could materialize down here, so having small chambers to station a squad of dwarves is pretty important. Even in the first cavern layer we were still having problems. While some of the more seasoned dwarves knew how to handle these monstrous plant creatures, some of the new recruits did not. But Selah Dwarf Fortress, where those brave dwarves came from, there were sure to be plenty more. In the summer of year 8, we had a Goristro show up to attack us. I wasn't sure what to make of this, so I opened the code just to see how big it was. Big, apparently. It looks something like this, and comes from Death Sword's monstrous manual mod. Though it was described as a siege engine, I figured anything that bleeds normally and has no armor ought to be no real challenge for a few good dwarves, so I only sent 2 squads out. A bigger concern were the citizens who were up on the surface doing regular chores. Would they be able to avoid the danger? The Goristro Fekakath quickly approached the fort, spotting a domesticated Gleamclaw outside and rushing toward it. At that same moment, Mafal Onelemis, a swords dwarf, rounded the corner and saw it. Though brave, they were no match for the Goristro alone, and it quickly gored their arms and then their head with its horns. Ouch. By this point, a mace dwarf, a hunting dog, and one of my militia commanders armed with an Urgrosh, an enormous axe, showed up. While the Goristro was preoccupied with the first 2, the militia commander got multiple incredible hits in. First, severing the Goristro's left leg, then disabling its hand, and then finally laying down brutal chop after brutal chop into the Goristro's left arm, upper body, and lodging their Urgrosh firmly into its skull. The threat was over. I was proud of my dwarves, and although it was sad to lose even one, I figured that going bravely into battle and being gored by an enormous monster was kind of the way to do it. But there was still a part of me that worried I was fostering a culture of violence that could explode at any moment. A few increasingly pent-up dwarves had taken to murdering our training fodder even before they made it to the training room. In turn, this random violence was making everyone else unhappy. On top of that, some bozo had migrated into the fort with an extremely valuable scroll he had stolen from an Aarakocra fortress, written by an Aarakocra who, later it was revealed, had said dwarves were and should be. Zokunushrir was an increasingly cosmopolitan fort, so this caused much controversy. While drama played out elsewhere in the fort, our goblin/orc pit engineers had broken through the first cave layer. This was expected, but posed a problem nonetheless, because it was now another potential point of entry for any forgotten beasts until we got it sealed up. This was, of course, the first thing that I did. It was good to feel like the fort had gotten self-sufficient enough that it could function on its own, a virtual ant farm of sorts. I could literally walk away and trust that everything functioned just fine for 15 or 20 minutes on end. Definitely a good feeling. Nothing happened this year. Well, not literally nothing. We trained the entire year, didn't get attacked, and I don't think anyone even came to trade. I just let the game run and watched number go up. Specifically the number on my military dwarves combat skills. Oh, my historian Olin created a rather interesting artifact. A pigtail thong, encircled with bands of pigtail and menacing with pigtail spikes, of course. I didn't know thongs were in the game, so I guess that's something, but let's move on. Year 10 started with a bang. Right out the gate, a human arrived, asking that we just give them Stukos Cattenrazes artifact, and all in the name of some drow who was living in a fortress with a few scions of the Saw, just chumming it up, I guess. Just because they won a few athletic events in some other fortress in our civ didn't give them any right to our great artifacts. Not even a week after we kicked the human out, we were attacked. I gathered everyone inside and we watched from the tower ramparts as the orcs milled about. I was about ready to go back into idle mode, but suddenly a loud roar erupted from the south. An Ettin, a giant two-headed monster, and it couldn't have come at a better time. The fantasy that had been crushed 2 years ago when we had the chance of a hill titan fighting a siege was finally happening now with the Ettin. The Ettin spotted the orcs from afar and moved to attack. The archers loosed devastating volleys of arrows. Armed with pikes, scourges, spears, and swords, the orcs surrounded the giant two-headed monster. Surrounded by so many enraged foes, the Ettin was powerless to fight back, and went down, easily. Some of the dwarves booed the orcs from the ramparts, but I was just happy that neither enemy could get inside. And I'm not just joking about the ramparts. I decided that since the Ettin had failed, I would see what we could do. The archers went up, and, it turns out the orcs were too stupid to notice us firing on them. It was kind of funny to just ping a few every now and then, though, even if it wasn't very effective. I decided to build a row of statues in the middle, to force the dwarves closer to the fortifications. Since they could dodge into the statues but wouldn't normally move into them, it was ideal for creating corridors like this. I slowly expanded the military. You'll notice many of the veteran squads are extremely well trained and well armed by now. The mountain home caravan also came back this year, and we bought parchment, fruits, fish, and livestock, all things that were just easier to buy. In return, we forked over dozens and dozens of electrum trinkets that were extremely valuable back in the homelands. The successful trading had me feeling excited, so I jumped the gun on a decision I'd been putting off for a long time. I decided to begin offensives on the orcs. I started with the fortress closest to us, a place called Fell Harshness, with only a few orcs in it. It had to be tiny. I sent one veteran squad and another relatively new squad with orders to burn it to the ground. Strangely enough, the dwarves I sent opted to travel via the caverns, which made me think Maybe this fortress actually was large enough to be connected underground. Maybe it was an old drow or even an old dwarven fortress simply taken over by the orcs. Less than a week after they left, they returned. Squad leader Zephon led the troops with a brilliant tactical plan. The battle was kind of insane, actually. It turns out that there were no orcs to be found, and instead they clashed with about 60 trolls and slew them all. Though I wished I could somehow take the trolls, I was happy with the beak dogs and crystalline chargers that they found, since both were animals it was nearly impossible to get in any other way. One unfortunate side effect of all this raiding that was about to happen was a bug that would crash my game if I tried to save squads with troops that had died abroad. You're gonna see me disband and reform squads every time they come home, so don't get used to their names. Listing all your deployments at the local VFW is a long-winded affair in Zokunushrir. We ended the year with more pit digging, marble mining, mob grinding, and animal training. This last one seemed especially significant. The few mold spawns we'd managed to capture were our biggest prides, since they symbolized, in a way, our battle against the unforgiving caverns. This was something to reflect on as we moved forward into the second half of Zokunushrir's existence. Now things were getting weird. We were getting invaded again, no surprise, but this time it wasn't by orcs. They were very tall, but they were still covered in metal armor? It was elves. I was confused. I frantically checked the map to make sure we weren't at war with the elves that we knew, but no. Everything was fine. Huh. Regardless, we had no choice but to defend ourselves. The elves might have been well armed, but they certainly weren't well trained. The battle was fierce, but they were frankly pitiful. A few dwarves sustained injuries, but I don't think we lost a single one in the fight. So who were these mystery invaders? I noticed something weird. They all had orcish names. The game even credited their attack to the orcs, but then I noticed that the leader, in Legends Viewer, had a dwarvish name. Why all this apparent secrecy, and where were the orcs involved? Well, the elves were not doing so well in the mythical domain, our version of the known world. There had once been 3 great civilizations of elves, but now there was only one. Perhaps these were the tribal remnants of the elves that lived here in the north, the Ash of Daggers. A group calling themselves the Ash of Daggers still came to trade with us. Those were the elves that kept showing up. It was sad to think about how different these fallen civilizations had become. I didn't know whether these elves really wanted to attack us, or whether they were forced by the orcs who, as you might be aware, are well known for eating babies. Perhaps they didn't want to be here at all. We had literally just finished looting the corpses of the elves when another monster attacked us, a minotaur. But at this point, I may as well not even mention it. That's how easy it went down. The year of weird happenings continued when I lost 3 miners in 2 separate incidents carving out the pit. If you looked at the message logs, you'd think that they were literally just struck down by God. No conflict, no fighting, just blunt trauma followed by death. These kinds of accidents might happen when dwarves accidentally mined down multiple levels or had rocks fall on them, but in this case they were just mining like normal. No crimes had been reported to the captain of the guard recently, so I had to assume that they really were just mining accidents, even if I didn't know how they'd come about. The pit was now inching below the second cavern layer, 22 Z levels deep. According to some dwarven scientists before me, it was most effective to have a drop of more than 25 Z levels, and I wasn't even close to done yet. We were rich, we were prosperous, and when the traders came by this year, they gave us the greatest news of all. Our queen had begun ordering offenses against the orcs as well. That winter, with the apparent increase in megabeast attacks, I decided to put a roof on the outside tower, since there was a non-zero chance that something could just fly over the top. However, the final attack of the year came from below. A forgotten beast arrived, another web spitter in the shape of a giant hairy frog with thin wings, not large enough to fly apparently. I sent in 3 squads of dwarves, but the Marks dwarves made it there first, once again doing great damage from range. By the time some of our war animals and spearmasters arrived, it had already eaten 5 dwarves, but it had been gravely injured. It succumbed to its injuries quickly. I think that keeping the beast distracted with war animals and ranged foes worked well once again, but if we hadn't had those, I'm pretty sure that this beast, Matto, would have killed a lot more. It's clear that Zokunushrir was now attracting global attention. We had everything that we needed to dominate the Orcs. I foresee only 1 or 2 more episodes left in this series, despite having over 80 hours of footage to sift through still. We're nearing our final goals, and all the background activity is just building towards that. Thanks for your support and patience while I navigate my busy real life, and I'll see you next time in Zokunushrir, Siege Quakes.